This is the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, episode 712, 4 Key Factors of Engagement with Mariana Aguilar. Welcome to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, hosted by author, educator, speaker, and mom, the Cool Cat teacher, Vicki Davis. Our focus on the front lines of education is to keep students engaged. We can never get enough ideas on how to help our students stay excited, engaged, and learning. With that in mind, we are pleased to welcome our guest today, Mariana Aguilar. She leads the research team at education technology company GoGuardian. In her role, she seeks to understand the relationship between the digital learning experience and student outcomes. Mariana began her career in education as a Teach for America Corps member. Since then, she has worked with various education nonprofits, including Murmuration and Citizens of the World Los Angeles. Well, you're in for a world of ideas today, so let's get started. Enjoy!
Educators, do you want the inside scoop on the latest student engagement techniques being used by districts, schools, and teachers in distance and hybrid learning? Then you need to download a copy of GoGuardian's 2020 State of Engagement Report, sponsor of today's show. Stay tuned at the end of the show to learn how to receive this valuable report. Today, we're talking about engagement. Mariana Aguilar leads the research team at education tech company GoGuardian. Now, I want to disclose that GoGuardian is the sponsor of this podcast episode. However, all of these opinions are my own as well as that of Mariana and her research team. So the State of Engagement Report, Mariana, is a report about student engagement in the classroom. So how would you define student engagement?
Great question. Thank you so much for having me on the show here today, Vicki. So after conducting field research with over 450 participants and various stakeholder groups represented from students, teachers, school leaders, and administrators, what we really found is that engagement is hard to define and hard to measure, but clearly visible. There was a shared sense of this feeling that you know it when you see engagement. One teacher described it as a buzz that you could just feel. And so while there is a kind of plethora of different constructs and definitions that exist in the literature around engagement, we also found this to be true with the stakeholders that we spoke with as a result of this research. And so defining engagement itself is a little bit difficult, but one thing that is certainly agreed upon is that it is clearly visible.
And we just know what it is. We know that the kids are involved. But when you look at engagement in the face-to-face classroom and engagement in distance learning, I know that you discovered that there's some commonalities. What would those be?
Yes, definitely. This is something that, I'm certain is top of mind for a lot of folks as we transition to hybrid and remote learning environments, is how much of the practices that occur in the classroom continue to ring true in a remote or hybrid learning environment. And so one of the things that we did as a part of this research was really to look at what does the existing literature say about the factors that impact student engagement in a remote and a hybrid context, and how does that relate to in-person learning? And what we found was that very similar to in-person learning experiences, factors like the design of the system, the distance learning system, the demands of the content itself, and the quality of the teacher are all things that continue to impact the student learning experience. And this rings true in both an online and a hybrid environment as well as in person.
I love that. Now, you also in the report split down the engagement best practices. You've got administrative, and I just want to point out, I love that the access to grants to try new things and funding is in there. So you've got several for administrative, you've got some school level factors, and you've got quite a few classroom factors, but we're going to kind of jump into some specific classroom factors. I loved the report that you quoted in a meta-analysis of K-12 distance learning environments that looked at the effects of over 14 web-delivered K-12 distance education programs. They said that there were factors such as design of distance learning system, demands of the content, and the quality of the teacher, as you just said, and we will include that in the show notes. So all of these things we're pulling into the classroom. What does that look like in terms of classroom factors?
Such a great point. So, a couple things that came out in our research and what we found is the importance of classroom culture and how this impacts the student experience and their engagement in the learning. And so, what this looks like in particular are things like a positive and a productive teacher student relationship, and how this contributes to students feeling willing to ask questions and willing to kind of go outside of their comfort zone. And so, this component of the relationship between the teacher and the student is a really core part of the classroom culture.
Yes, and you said the two-way communication between them. And I think that's important, is that two-way communication is there, whether it's online or face-to-face, right?
Absolutely. It's actually really interesting that you mentioned that. I'll share a quick preview of some of our kind of latest research that has really shown, surprisingly, I think, while most of us may have anticipated that the majority of video conferencing and synchronous communication in a remote learning environment is happening in groups, there is actually a ton of communication that is happening between teachers and students one-on-one. And so what this indicates to us is that video conferencing and these communication tools have become really integral to the ability to maintain that positive and productive teacher-student relationship and communicate even when they may not be in person or in the same classroom.
And, for me as a teacher, it's changed my relationship because there have been several times where I've, quote, had lunch with some kids while we were on vacation or whatever. Or we might say, okay, let's get together in Zoom tonight and have a quick meeting. And we're all at home, so we don't have that drive time. We don't have to get home late. And we just jump in a 15 to 20-minute meeting to take care of business. And so in some ways, I think there's some new things that we hopefully won't let go of. Now, I love your focus on the zone of proximal development. So, a lot of folks are educators who listen to my show, but some may not be aware of what that is. How does the zone of proximal development and engagement relate?
So glad you brought this one up. This is key, and this came up quite a bit, actually over 1 in 3 of the field research instances touched upon the importance of the zone of proximal development. So for folks who may not be familiar with the zone of proximal development, this framework is really what is sometimes colloquially referred to as the Goldilocks framework, right? So knowing the level that your students are at and being able to provide them with a learning experience that is not too hard and not too easy, but just right. And so it's in that zone where students are able to feel that just right challenge that's going to keep them engaged, but not frustrated, nor is it too easy that they are going to get bored. And so really delivering learning experiences that are within a student's zone of proximal development, that just right area for them, is really critical to keeping them engaged. Because if you go too far in either direction, you really risk overwhelming them or boring them. And so that is one of the key strategies that teachers can leverage for really facilitating an engaging learning experience for their students.
I love that. So if it's too hard, like too far out of that zone, they'll disengage. And if it's just too easy and, quote, boring, they'll disengage. So this means we have to personalize, but that's so hard.
It is so hard. I think this is where I would really encourage teachers to draw upon some of those core instructional strategies. So, for example, that the material might be too hard for your students if you can see that they are tuning out or asking a ton of questions about what certain terminology even means when defining a concept. And so that is one of those signs, for example, that it's really an opportunity for you as an instructor to go back and scaffold that material by providing that prerequisite knowledge. So I think really looking for what are those indications that perhaps the experience is outside the zone of proximal development, and then being able to tailor one's instruction in the moment is so important to being able to maintain the engagement of students.
How about it being relevant and relatable? Explain that.
Yes, this one came up quite a bit, actually. Also, more than 1 in 3 of our field research instances. And this one came up both from teachers and also from students as they articulated what would make them feel most engaged. And so this could range from anything like having a pop culture reference to a piece of content, being able to relate a math concept to sports, or being able to weave in a reference to gaming at the start of a lesson using that kind of hook to spark a student's interest. But this also looked like teachers being able to take information or content that perhaps is so far from a student's reality and making it real for them. And so the example that I call to mind, I think it's extremely illustrative of this concept, was a teacher who shared that when she teaches U.S. history to her fifth graders and they come across the word bayonet, she hears them sound it out, bayonet. And oftentimes they will find themselves saying, oh, yeah, I know that word. And she asks them, oh, what is that? And they kind of describe, I think it's a weapon. And she described that this is one of her kind of favorite lessons that she teaches every year, because years ago she had gone to a history museum and she actually got a bayonet, kind of a toy bayonet example. And so she pulls it out and she says, this is a bayonet. And they're like, oh, and their eyes widen. And she asks, does anyone want to hold it? And they pass it around the room and they're looking at the bayonet. And all of a sudden in that moment, right, she's really making this foreign concept, this historical weapon that is so far disconnected from a modern child or student or even adult's life. She's bringing that into their construct of what is real. And so now they have a schema for what a bayonet is. And every time they encounter that word, even if it's years later in their AP US history class, right, they have a much more relatable concept. And so they can build upon that. So I think those are just a couple examples of how we heard and saw educators really intentionally making content relevant and relatable to students.
Love that. And there's much more we could go into, but the one last little piece is digital content designed with an intent to enable focus. Now, I write for the web and I also write books. So when I write for the web, I will sometimes have a one-sentence paragraph. Like all those grammatical rules of writing that we learn as educators, they're different when you design online content, aren't they?
Absolutely. And this was an example that came out really clearly in actually conversations with students. And the one that I'll share with you, because I think it illustrates it so well, was a second grader who said, sometimes my teacher assigns various pieces of content, and I have to scroll all the way down, and then I have to scroll all the way back up to even answer the question, and then I lose my place. And it's so hard and it's so distracting. And so I kind of get bored or I lose my interest. And so here you have a student who's probably 7, and they're able to essentially articulate that this experience that they're having on the web is actually distracting them, despite the fact that they want to complete the lesson, they want to be successful at it, but the way the actual interface is designed and the way the information is being presented is distracting to them.
Well, I do encourage everyone to read the report. I think there are a lot of practical ideas for educators. It's the State of Engagement Report 2020. We will include this in the show notes. It's a great overview of distance learning and how we can engage our students. I think it has a lot of wonderful ideas. So thank you, Mariana.
Thank you so much for having me here today, Vicki. It was a pleasure, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Educators, I've just read an eye-opening report which includes valuable classroom research and information on distance learning best practices. It's called GoGuardian's State of Engagement Report. This is a must-read, so I'm sharing it with you. You may be interested to know that many teaching techniques that boost the excellence of student engagement can also be applied to remote teaching. Engagement can go up even though the environment is very different. There's so much more in this report. Download your copy of the State of Engagement Report 2020 from GoGuardian now at coolcatteacher.com/engage for the latest research on student engagement. That's coolcatteacher.com/engage now.